trade is on the agenda of the upcoming summit between President Lee Jae Myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump at the White House next Monday. That is August 25th. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome to Tuesday's edition of Press Perspective. It's August 19th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Among the issues of mutual interest on the agenda of the upcoming South Korea-U.S. summit is bilateral trade. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Good to see you.
I also have Professor Song Soo-young at Chung-Ang University live on the line. Professor Song, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and good evening to you and Stephen.
Right, thank you, Professor. We will start here in the studio. So, Stephen, as I mentioned in this short clip, trade is expected to top talks between President Lee Jae Myung and his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump at the White House next Monday. That would be August 25th. Before we delve into details of that upcoming summit, do remind us about the trade framework hammered out by officials from the two countries in late July, I believe. What was agreed upon and what remains to be addressed, Stephen?
Well, I think framework and details are kind of the two key words there. Like the agreement that was reached a few weeks ago is really just kind of a framework. It's kind of like general principles. I mean, there are some specifics. Seoul committed to $350 billion of investments in the U.S. And in return for that, the U.S. agreed to lower tariffs from 25% to 15%. And those are still some pretty high tariffs, compared to like any other time of contemporary trade history. But what it did was it allowed South Korea to be on a kind of even field of competition with other exporters, so it doesn't leave South Korean exports at a kind of competitive disadvantage. So in that agreement, they talked about working together in manufacturing, in semiconductors, in critical minerals, in various forms of technology. A lot of South Korean firms already have like very big operations in the U.S. and they have increased their operations there even before Trump came to power and even before all these trade tensions started. Under the Biden administration, under the CHIPS Act, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of that had a lot of Korean involvement and involved Korean companies expanding their presence there. So since this agreement was reached, there's been some rumblings in the domestic medias of both countries about like what implementation of this is going to mean. My understanding of it is that this agreement does not have like a very comprehensive written component. Like the officials from the two sides have not been able to work out the finer points of it. So that remains to be seen. It's useful to recall, I think, that these countries have a bilateral free trade agreement that took effect in, I believe it was 2012. And that was the result of some very long, very painstaking negotiations as they pored over how opening their trade would affect sensitive sectors, like in Korea, agriculture is a big one. And there are others. And so we're at a stage where, like, I think we're going to, when President Lee is in the United States next week, we're going to see if there are any kind of similar barriers to implementation and just what implementation might mean. I think both sides are well-intentioned and are trying to reach an agreement that they find mutually satisfactory, but we'll see.
Right. Staying with that, Professor Song, as Stephen mentioned, South Korea has pledged $350 billion in investments, including $150 billion in shipbuilding and $100 billion in energy purchases. Professor Song, what's your take on the feasibility and the potential timeline of these investment commitments?
Yeah, numerically, it's a huge amount of investment. It's like a foreign direct investment, usually which occurred from the advanced country to the lower developed country or less developing country. But actually, this is totally opposite way. But however, we need to identify what is the background and the backdrop of this kind of investment plan has been talked and discussed and will be implemented in the future, and how it will be played out. First of all, as you mentioned, and the overview is well summarized, and by Steven, and also you mentioned that $350 billion investment, including $150 billion in shipbuilding, which was already initiated as far as I'm concerned. And another one is the liquefied natural gases has been imported. And this is actually what we are supposed or we are anticipating. But in further, the remaining part, which will be invested, of course, the field and which kind of industry has been already designated, determined, and according to Mr. Trump's remark, he has decided which industry investment, even how the proceeds or the profit or return could be used. That will, according to Secretary of Commerce, Mr. Lutnick has mentioned that it will be used for the American people. However, the White House, Caroline Leavitt has mentioned it will be used to pay for the government deficit or debt. So it's going to be really some problematic considering the future, but we need to think of how it will be used and how it will be made to help build some autos or semiconductor companies, and several conditions should be met. So I think we should not be in a hurry to provide the fund, this huge amount of the money, because in the year of 2024, we have recorded the trade surplus against the United States, almost $66 billion. So that is almost a very big increase and surge of the surplus. The reason is because of Trump itself. He announced, he has mentioned he's going to impose the huge tariffs. Therefore, importers in U.S., they would like to accumulate the inventory as much as possible. That's why we had such a big surplus. Therefore, this is not going to be a trend at all. So considering that part, we need to take time and slow the process of investment and what would be mutually beneficial to U.S. and Korea. And also we need to take into account of some diversification of the trade route. That is, I think, should be adopted by the President Lee Jae Myung's response to the United States, the demand or request during his visit to U.S.
Right, cautious steps toward commitments then.
Yes.
Steven, with regard to shipbuilding, U.S. lawmakers also appear to be taking an active interest in this particular field. Could you tell us more?
Well, this has been talked about for a long time as an area of complementary, kind of overlapping interests between the two countries. The U.S. shipbuilding capacity has waned significantly in recent decades. The U.S. was once a quite imposing shipbuilding power, but due to a number of factors such as high labor costs and the advancement of shipbuilders like Japan, South Korea, and China, the U.S. has kind of downsized its shipyards quite dramatically. And because the U.S. and South Korea have this long-standing defense alliance, of which the mutual interchange between their navies is a big part of it, some people have highlighted the possibility that Washington could leverage these relationships with its allies who happen to be quite advanced shipbuilding nations to restore this capability and to potentially leave. The subtext of this is that it would leave the U.S. in a better position to maintain its forces if it were to engage in a conflict with China. But recently there was this delegation of U.S. senators who traveled to Korea to see this all for themselves and to gauge the possibility of interchange and of partnerships between South Korean firms and with what's happening in the U.S. So basically, I think they wanted to see if there were the possibility of forming joint ventures that would allow for either the construction or the repair of non-combatant vessels. I'm not an expert on this, but I believe that the U.S. has some legislation that prevents foreign shipbuilders from constructing vessels that are used that would be used in combat in the U.S. Navy. So on paper, this all looks good, but I've talked to a couple of experts who have raised some quite serious questions about the feasibility of this. There's questions as to, does the United States have enough inexpensive labor to really revive its shipbuilding sector? Does it have the kind of engineers and the kind of skilled tradespeople that are needed on shipyards, having had these idle shipyards for so long? I mean, if you talk to, as I've done, if you go down to Gajedo or Ulsan and you talk to shipbuilders, they'll really flag the challenges that come with having enough skilled labor on work sites at the time, in part due to the very cyclical nature of the shipbuilding industry. I mean, you might get a few orders and need to increase your manpower very drastically, and then you might have a kind of fallow period. So this is another one of those things where I think on a conceptual level, there's mutual interest in pursuing deals, but it comes down to details again, and there's a lot to be worked out.
Right, as we keep saying, the devil is in the details. Meanwhile, Professor Song, despite the trade framework, efforts to hammer out a trade agreement with the U.S., the state-run KDI says the Korean economy will grow less than 1% this year. Could you tell us a bit more about this particular projection, including your prospects, Professor Song, and possible measures, of course, to address the dismal growth outlook for South Korea?
Actually, Stephen has mentioned that always the evils are hidden in the details. So when you look into the KDI prospect about the GDP growth rate of South Korea in 2025 and 2026 has been revised since the first day of the 2025. We have experienced a negative GDP growth rate in the final quarter of 2024 due to some kind of insurrection and rebellion and some abrupt declaration of martial law. And then we expect a very fast recovery from that. At least that was shown in the Kospi index. But however, in the real economy, it is less than expected. Because the main primary reason is total consumption has been shown some contribution of the increased by as much as 0.2 percentage point. But in a total fixed investment, quite particularly in the construction investment, has been dramatically decreased by 8.1% minus. So that is direct down the Korean economy's, domestic economy's potential growth. So therefore, I think the primary reason why construction industry has suffered so much from the declining economy is, first of all, to help relieve the burden of the construction industry in the domestic economy is relieve the interest rate. So which means currently we have 2.5%, and then because of the rather than consumption level in U.S. is good, and then the problem is the newly created job is declining. Therefore, I expect 2 times the decrease of the federal funds rate. But rather than U.S., Korean economy, domestic economy is worse than U.S. economy. Therefore, we need to reduce the interest rate and to relieve the burden of interest rate on the industry. And also, I'm not sure this reduction of interest rate could help increase the consumption, but there is some positive. But primary effect of the decreased interest rate would be help the fixed investment and some further corporations and construction investment. So to that regards, I think the first half we have only in 2025 is a 0.2% of the GDP growth rate, and I expect 1.3 or 4% growth rate was expected by and calculated by the KDI, and most of the other institutions would have the same one. Of course, in 2026, it would be better, but currently our economy is relying on the growth rate of the GDP in 2025 relies on actually the export to U.S. and other countries, but we have to focus on the domestic economy, not only the consumption, but also some fixed investment. That is the key to reinvigorate South Korean economy and the GDP growth on the right track, and then expecting future prospect of the GDP growth rate would be improved.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, back on the trade front, Stephen, there has been quite a bit of coverage about from the media about U.S. tariffs reshaping trade relationships between its traditional partners. This being said, what can you tell us about the future cooperation that South Korea and Vietnam have promised to promote following their summit talks last week?
I don't think I would describe this as a reshaping exactly, as having read the statements that came out of the summit between Lee and Tolam it was more just a kind of agreement that this is a relationship that is headed in a very positive direction, where there's a lot of mutually beneficial elements, there's a lot of mutual complementarity, and so it just makes sense to try to take it to the next level. So following that summit, I believe that the two leaders announced that they would attempt to escalate their annual trade volume to something like $150 billion. And if I remember correctly, last year it had been something like 86.7 billion. So it's a very significant increase. And so it's, again, I want to flag that I don't think that the Korea-Vietnam relationship has been fundamentally changed. I think it's just that over the past several years, trade between these two countries has gone up quite significantly. There's been interchange on a number of levels. A huge number of South Korean tourists go to Vietnam on vacation. There are Vietnamese workers who come here and work in agriculture and manufacturing. There's all these areas in where the two sides feel like they have benefited from working together more. And I think it's mostly just that seeing the changes in the international trade environment, the need to have multiple partnerships. A country like South Korea cannot rely simply on trade between the U.S. and with China, as it has customarily for quite some time, that it really makes sense to have a strong and kind of less politicized relationship, like as what South Korea and Vietnam are providing. These are two countries that I think, don't have a lot of the historical baggage that some bilateral relationships in this part of the world has. I mean, South Korean soldiers did participate in the Vietnam War. There is a number of factors at play, but by all appearances, these are just two countries that have quite positive impressions of each other. A lot of, like I said, a lot of people from both countries visit the other place, and so I would just say that the way that the trade tensions have affected this particular bilateral relationship is it just kind of underscored the importance of maximizing the potential benefits of positive relationships where they are. And I think that's the consensus that President Lee and Tolam reached. And I think we can all expect that they will continue to take steps in this very cooperative direction.
Right then, Professor Song, broadly speaking, can greater trade with other ASEAN partners offset U.S. market restrictions for South Korea, do you think?
I believe the reason why Trump administration imposed a higher tariff against the ASEAN countries such as Vietnam and Malaysia has not been decided yet, but Indonesia and other countries. We have to look into what is the reason why Trump imposed a higher tariff, because those countries were used as an alternative route to make exports to the United States originated from China. Therefore, that's why, in order to block those alternate route, then U.S. president has imposed such a high tariff. Then, considering this situation, why we need to increase some trade volume with these Asian countries? Because Asian countries necessarily they would like to find some other countries to import their exports. So to that regards, South Korea, our country could have imported some Chinese-originated products through those Asian countries and at a really cheap price. So that is going to help Korean economy to reinvigorate or recover and relieve the burden of the import price. On the other hand, what kind of products could be exported to these countries? First of all, I think some weapons, particularly the armaments and some very important weapons could be sold to these countries, because actually they would like to purchase more, maybe advanced weapons from U.S. and other countries, but actually that is much more expensive. And technically, the Korean product, such as weapons, is as good as the United States, not maybe similar level to the equivalent level. And on the other hand, they need also some advanced technically advanced products, such as other semiconductors and or some kind of technology issues and other things. So to that regard, the Asian countries should be a very important guest. Also, the source of the supply, some intermediate goods that would be of use and of help to Korean economy. So to that regards, the visiting of the General Secretary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, Tho Lim, actually his name is in Korean pronunciation is So Lim, actually. So because even though they used some alphabet representation of their characters, but actually he must be welcome, and the $150 billion trade increase, that is very promising. That should be spread out to other countries, including Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand, which have some substantial and significant GDP purchasing power. So that is, I think, very promising and good news for Korean economy.
Right, and speaking about the Korean economy, earlier on, Professor Song spoke about how fixed investments here could be one option to bolstering the country's GDP. Staying with that, Stephen, a recent article carried by the Straits Times claims that opening doors to 1 million more foreign graduates here in South Korea may tangibly boost its GDP. Could you explain this suggestion for us?
Sure. This is some really quite interesting research. It was published by the Korea Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and it was carried out by a professor at Korea-U University. And so the argument here is that if you had 1 million foreigners who were graduating from South Korean universities, if you gave them a path to stay, if you allowed them to work legally here and kind of live in the country indefinitely, that would have an effective economic stimulus that would be worth $100 billion. I haven't really gone through this study and parsed exactly how what they attribute that to, like where they see this economic stimulus effect coming from, but it's a kind of specific rendering of an old idea, not just here in Korea, but all over the world, that if you are in a kind of low growth scenario, if you are in a low fertility scenario like South Korea is, then it makes sense to, I believe former President Yoon Suk-yeol actually suggested something like this because he thought that if you take people who are studying in the country who already have some familiarity with how things work in Korea, who have lived here, who have some understanding of the language, who are kind of integrated to some extent, and you just, instead of bringing in new immigrants, if you just allowed these people to stay, it could result in a kind of smoother adaptation process. It would make the whole endeavor kind of easier for everyone involved. These are the kinds of ideas that we're going to see bandied about more and more in the coming years as South Korea continues to grapple with this low fertility present and future. The birth rate has actually ticked up a little bit over this year, so it's that's kind of a positive sign. But this is an old, I remember last year, I think it was, the Bank of Korea put out a report, arguing that South Korea ought to do things like bring in foreign laborers and then pay them less than the minimum wage, which is something that the country doesn't do at the moment, and I think is would be a contravention of kind of international standards of labor regulations. So the reason that I mentioned that is that's just another kind of unconventional or kind of outside the box thinking idea that might go some distance to resolving this old and very contemporary issue of how to revitalize the economy and how do you revitalize rural areas. South Korea has a lot of universities that are in second or third tier cities around the country who really do need injections of new vitality. So I hope this is something that policymakers ought to take seriously, and they ought to be, going around the country and engaging with people who live in these less populated areas and trying to get a sense from them, because, on a national level, there can be, anti-outsider or anti-immigrant sentiment, but in some cases, when you go, I've done this, if you go and report in these economically waning places, the people there sometimes are quite excited about the prospect of immigrants because they see them as a boon to their future. So there's a lot there to discuss.
Right, for sure. Quite a number of scholars talk about how immigration might be one of the most viable options to addressing South Korea's declining workforce. All right, Stephen, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and thoughts. And Professor Song over in Ulsan, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you for inviting me.
Right, that ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again same time tomorrow for more panel discussion.